interest of the quality time today, I thought we'd get started. Welcome to Union Mill, and welcome to the first brown bag lunch we've hosted here as well. I look around this room and I'm in awe of the work that you all are doing, and humbled to have you all here in this setting. The leadership issue is really on the forefront of all of our minds, and how is it that we in fact lead our organizations? What roles do we take for people looking at us within our own organization and those from the outside in terms of how we do the work we're doing? The leadership dynamics have changed dramatically. How do we think of it in terms of relationships and possibilities? So I've had the opportunity to know Cheryl Walker for some time in association with an organization in Howard County called Sophie, which has had a history of doing really marvelous things around sort of the wellness and thought processes of education, and do a significant amount of work with acupuncture, but they really have a whole sense of what this leadership dynamic is all about. And so what I hope today ends up being is sort of the first, in an hour and a half, to give you all the issues around the leadership question is a taste of the apple. And so what we hope is, if there's real interest after this, to be able to figure out what group would like to continue in these conversations around leadership. I could read you Cheryl's bio. I don't think that would give you any greater sense than having some trust in me that what you're about to listen to and be a part of is exactly thinking forward about what possibilities there are for us as leaders, what possibilities there are within our organization, and those people that are working with us to take a significant role in this leadership piece. And so without further ado, Professor?
I'm Cheryl Walker, and I'm really, really excited to be here. I can't wait to have a tour of the building. Just a tiny bit about me, just so it set some context. At the Sophie Institute, I head up a program called Transformative Leadership and Social Change, and it's a master's degree program as well as a graduate certificate program teaching people values-driven, heart-centered leadership. And what we know is that leadership always begins with ourselves. How do we lead ourselves? So that's a little bit about what I do on a daily basis, is run this program. I also have a background. I went to Georgetown University and studied business leadership in the business school at Georgetown. And what I learned there, in all the research that's out there, is that the best leadership is heart-centered leadership, values-driven leadership. So I think this is probably nothing new to you, and why you're called to doing the work that you do. Another little piece that just dawned on me when I walked in and I saw all the chairs set up here for today is, before I worked at Sophie a couple of times. I was dean of students, and then I left a while, and I was doing my own consulting, and I also do leadership coaching. I was working for a small international organizational development firm called Transformation Strategies, and I developed there a division for developing leadership in nonprofits. And my vision, actually, and I didn't share this with you, Don, was actually to bring people together under one roof from different agencies to work together, to learn together, to study together, to create what we like to call a learning field. Because I really do believe that we learn in community, and that in community we can create a field for our learning. So I hope in this brief time today that we will create a learning field together, and that you'll leave here with some very tangible things to use and take back into your work. I have some things that I planned for you, and also left my outline home today, which is always a good sign to me. I've only done it twice, and it always shows me that this stuff is really, really in my heart, and I'm really passionate about it. And I'd like this to be informal. I have some activities planned, interactive activities planned, but also please, at any point, stop me and ask questions. Because certainly if you're sitting with a question, I always know there's at least 3 or 4 or 5 other people that have the same question. So that will add to our learning for today. So It's interesting that in a leadership group, there's nobody, only one person sitting in the front. So I wish that I could hear about who everybody is, your names and what you do, and that would take all of our time. So as a way of getting us all in the room together, you all should have a card. So pass that out, and we're going to use that in a minute. And even before we begin, think for a moment of one thing that you were involved in this week or last week. One thing at your workplace that you are really proud of. And you can jot it down on the card. Yep. One thing that you did or were involved in some way you were involved in this past week or the week before, but pretty recent, that you are really proud of. Can I have some volunteers? What's one thing that happened in your workplace that you are really proud of? Yes?
I'm Tyler Gerhardt. I'm with Preservation Maryland.
Okay.
We had a letter to the editor published yesterday about tax credit legislation that Senator Cardin sponsored at our request. That is an incentive for historic preservation projects like the one we're in that Donald did at the mill. And so the fact that we got that legislation sponsored and then get some credit for it in the publication is a great thing for our organization.
Okay, so legislation sponsored. It is a great thing. Okay, who wants to build on that? Another thing that happened recently that you are proud of.
I'll talk about client success. I'm Bill McCarthy with Catholic Charities. We graduated 33 men from our Christopher Place program, formerly homeless ex-offenders, meaning they continuously work and live in the community for a year or more.
Great, great. Okay, another success, something you're proud of. Yes.
My name is Shannon Coleman Siciliano. I'm with Child First and the Baltimore Education Coalition. On Monday, we had our BEC legislative night in Annapolis with two different legislative districts, District 41 and 46. And we had approximately 400 parents and staff members that were present to meet with their legislators around school facilities and school funding.
Wow, great. Yes, I think we could applaud all of you. Okay, somebody else. One thing that happened in your workplace that you were involved in that you are proud of.
So I facilitated the communication between someone who's relatively new to the office and someone who's been at the office longer. Conversation across people coming from different backgrounds and different cultures. And I'm not going to say everything is wonderful and that there was complete understanding, but it's an ongoing process, but we started and it's spreading. So.
You started something, so it took some steps forward. Great, I think we can. And small successes are equally as important as large successes. So how about two more? Something that you're proud of. Yes?
I'm from Catholic Charities as well, I'm Lauren Dellavelle, and in our treated foster care program, we have been developing a campaign to recruit foster parents, and it's called Inspire a Lifetime, and we're really proud of that.
Inspire a lifetime. Very good. Wonderful. Thank you. And one more. Yes.
Hi, I'm Jessica from Playworks, and I had a really fantastic conversation just this morning with someone from the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine about bringing some of their medical residents out to Baltimore City schools to play at recess and to be part of our movement for play and physical activity across the idea that there are people doing work in Baltimore City and they have no connection to the kids in Baltimore City is a little bit of an unfortunate thing. So this is a great opportunity to think about how to engage a set of folks who are living and working here with all of us.
It's wonderful. Congratulations. So more and more studies come out that when we build on successes, when we look at what the assets are in our organizations, in our institutions, personally, in the people that we work with, when we look at the assets, when we look at the strengths and we build on them, we are more apt to get success. We're more apt to reach our goals. And we have a saying that we use at Thai Sophia, and I'd love you to write that down, that it's not that when we ask the question or if we look out to what's happening in our workplace, it's not so much to look at what's wrong and how do we fix it, but rather what's possible here and how do we create it. What's possible here and how do we create it? And I have no doubt that Don and his son asked this question, like what is possible and how do we create it? And we live in extraordinary times right now where I don't know anybody, both personally and professionally, that does not have to do with less. And so how can we each day wake up and ask the question, like what is possible here? And how do we, not just me, but how do we create something new? So we have this little drawing, and it's not a flag, but imagine this was your garden. Imagine this is a garden. And there's one little corner in the garden that somehow seems to be flourishing. What we look at is how do we expand that? How do we take in our organizations, in the people that we're working with, in ourselves, how do we look at what are our assets and how do we build upon them? Now, this isn't a Pollyanna kind of attitude. It's not that we don't look at our challenges or our problems. It's not that we don't even use the word problem. But it's how do we look at it? What lens do we look out at the challenges that are before us? How do we look at it? And what do we say about them? That's what makes the difference between success and maybe stagnation. And I think, again, standing in this building is a great example of that. That the mannequins looked at a situation that could have been called a challenge and said, what's possible here? So I like to say that there's two sides here to a leadership coin. You know, one side is to look at a challenge and to look at it straight on, but then to flip it and to say, what's possible here? What can we create? Not to ignore this side, but to look and say, what is it that we can create here together? So any questions or comments about that lens, that way of thinking? Okay, so Don sent you an email. We gave you a little bit of homework. We asked you, as one of the things, to think about somebody that you know, whether it's a famous person, or just a person that you know in your workplace, a person that you know in your life, or you have known, or you read about, that you consider a great leader. And on the other side of the card, think of that person right now and write down just one characteristic or quality that you perceive that person to have. And just write that down. Okay, who has one written down?
I put Maya Angelou,
Okay, and what's one quality?
that she gained strength through her history of diversity,
Through her history of diversity.
adversity.
Through her, okay.
Through her
So,
childhood history and some of her experiences, and
okay,
it helped her to deal later in life with some of the struggles that she was faced with. She faced a lot of adversity.
so a way she did just that, she took what could have been perceived as wrong, and I think we'd all agree, many of those things were wrong, but she said, what are the possibilities here? So what quality, what would you call that quality?
Perseverance.
Perseverance, okay. Could you write down perseverance? And bring that up to me? Okay, somebody else? Humility? Okay, can you write that down and pass that up? Okay, somebody else?
Choral director, choir director, and
Choir director?
her ability to creatively motivate her team.
Okay, motivate. Would you write down motivate? Okay,
Creative is the word.
okay. If you just leave them here for now. Okay, somebody else? Yes.
So, I thought of the principal of my high school,
Uh-huh.
who was this incredibly enthusiastic person, very sort of warm and smiled a lot, and just was like loved her job, and was enthusiastic about her leadership of this school. So I don't know.
So
what to call it.
enthusiasm, inspiring, maybe? Okay, either one, if you would write that down, okay?
As a coach, carrying coach in my former high school, Donald Davis, the football coach, was very persistent. When they've had success, and last year, the day after the final game, he was out recruiting, doing what's necessary to keep being successful. So he's very persistent.
Persistent, okay, persistent, okay. Take a couple of more. Yes,
Wit,
wit.
yes.
And what do you mean by wit?
The ability to keep people with you by good humor.
Good humor.
I mean, it's one of my former law partners that I'm thinking of, and he had a great many positive characteristics, some of which have been named, but that's one that I think enabled him to be a successful leader.
Okay, wit, I think that's great. One thing that I want to mention about wit is that it does create a mood, an organizational mood. And if you think about it, moods are contagious. They're like viruses. Any of you have teenage daughters or had teenage daughters?
Been around for me.
I had 3. They're grown now. Their mood would just like spread. You know, one person would get in a bad mood and it would just spread. And the same would be for a good mood. And the same thing happens in our organizations. Think about the people who you gravitate toward. So mood matters. So definitely wit, I would consider a leadership competency. Yes,
Visionary.
visionary.
I'm
Okay.
thinking specifically about how Thurman, who was actually one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s teachers in seminary school, who had a direct connection to Gandhi, and who back in the early 30s actually established the first faith community for people of all ethnic backgrounds. It's a very radical thing for religious settings.
So So say the quality again.
Visionary.
Visionary. Yeah, I also hear,
Capacity to
I also
think
hear,
outside the box.
I also hear persistence in there
Mhm.
too, but definitely visionary. Will you pass that forward? Okay, let's take two more. Yes,
Passionate.
passionate. Okay, do you want to tell
I'm
us?
really thinking about a few different folks.
Okay.
Really, the people who particularly inspire and are really passionate, because it's leading at the heart. which is,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm really passionate about
Yeah.
the mission.
Yeah, and you can't fake that.
Yeah.
And that is something that I do believe is contagious. Think about anybody that you know that's passionate. You just want to go along with them. So passionate. And I'll take one more. Okay.
Okay. Everybody ready to chuckle? Donald. And I think the reason Donald is such a good leader is that he's a leader who provides tools to others so that they themselves can be empowered.
So empowering others.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Okay, so now I want you to help me with this. So we say that if you were to break down leadership competencies, and people do this in a lot of different ways, but this is one way I do it. You can separate people out, you can separate the competencies out into results, getting results, and building relationships. So results and relationships. And there's definitely overlay with them, no doubt. But this is another one of those places where I say the leadership coin, front of the coin, back of the coin, leaders that absolutely get results, and leaders that absolutely build strong relationships. So some of these are going to fall in between, but let's just see what you think. So passionate as a leadership competency. Results, relationship, or both? Both. I think so.
We're going to interrupt in the last group.
Welcome, welcome. Okay, creatively motivate team, so motivate. You have to put it on one side or the other. Motivate, yeah, I would put it on relationship. Clearly, if we want to get results, it does help to do this, but we're talking here about building relationships. Okay, humility. Any of you familiar with the book Good to Great, the leadership book? That was one of the things that in their study that they found that surprisingly these very successful leaders were not what we might consider charismatic. They were humble. They were in the background. So humility. Enthusiasm and inspirational. The words? You want to write?
Well, just because it'll be larger and easier to see.
Yeah, great, that would be great. Okay. Visionary. Now, I want to just take a minute or two just to look at visionary. So visionary, I think, is essential. I think that most great leaders that have created change had a vision. I think probably all great leaders. But do you know any leaders that have vision rather, who are really strong visionaries and yet cannot produce results? So I want to point that out because we put it under results and it's key. I mean, I think it definitely is a skill, it's a talent, it's a gift. I think it's one that we all want to cultivate And that one definitely, we want to make sure is paired. And it doesn't necessarily have to be paired in one person, though. If you are a strong visionary, sometimes you need to work with somebody very closely who's very results oriented. So I just wanted to point that out. Persistence or perseverance. I'll let Donald just write them down. Wit. Relationships. Oh, persistent. Perseverance, persistent. Providing tools for others. I would put it in both, wouldn't you? Empowering others is a really key piece to building relationships and getting results from people. So again, that ties in with the asset building, looking at what strengths does a person have and building on it. Okay, so again, I wanted you to be aware of two places where we want to look at the front of the hand and the back of the hand of the leadership coin. And one of the things that I know about leadership, and the more and more you study leadership, there are millions, I think, of these coins that really the field of leadership is about working with what might appear to be paradox. So at any point you find yourself in the world of paradox, like it's this and that, results and relationships, you know that you're really in the leadership field, and really great leaders learn how to hold both. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's something that I want you to go away thinking about in your own leadership. If you come across a quandary and it looks like they may actually be opposing, the greatest thing you can do is to ask yourself, how do I hold both of these? And just something to think about. So now, just because we are limited in time, I want to go back now and revisit this whole notion of building on strengths and building on assets and what's working. And I want to tell you a little parable, and it comes from this book called The Art of Possibility. Maybe you want to, Donald, if you just write this down. This is a really wonderful book. That's a great leadership guide. So in this book, they tell a story about a shoe manufacturing company that sends two representatives, two marketing, you know the story? Sends two marketing representatives to a small village in Africa. They get to Africa, and the first one writes back and says, "This situation is terrible. It's hopeless. The people do not wear shoes." The second person writes back and says, "Amazing, amazing opportunity. The people don't wear shoes." So pretty simplistic. And yet, I think you can imagine versions of this happening all the time. So what's the obvious outcome of these two different people? Same situation, two different messages back home. Obviously, who has the most chance of success?
The one who was positive.
Yeah, the one who saw possibility. Again, possibility. What's possible here? not what's broken, but what's possible here. So what happened in that situation is they looked at the exact situation, what we call the phenomenon. Anybody in a room would look and say, they don't wear shoes. You couldn't argue that. And yet one person looked through the lens and said opportunity, and one looked through the lens and said hopeless. So as we proceed today, and then when you leave here, really start paying attention to where do I do that? Now, I've been studying this and teaching this for about almost 15 years now. I can walk into my office on a day, pull out my Outlook calendar that I've printed out, and there's not one space, free space in the day. And my first reaction can be, oh my God, I'm never going to do this. This is impossible. I have no way I can get through this day. My boss is going to be angry at me. My assistant's going to be angry at me. My students are going to be angry at me. I'm going to get fired. If I keep cycling down in the same way, and I'll get fired, and then I have to go and live with my children. Okay? And this could happen in a matter of 10 minutes, okay? But I know better. So I step back, and I say, what is the phenomenon here? So, what are the facts, and what's the interpretation? When we think of the shoe people, the facts where they don't wear shoes, the interpretation. Here's the dissection of mine, okay? The phenomena, I look at my calendar. Nancy needs a report by 5 o'clock today. I have 3 meetings scheduled. Each of them are an hour and a half long. I have 25 papers to grade, blah, 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 blah. That's the phenomenon. Any one of you looked at my calendar, that's what you would see. On this side, these could be my interpretations. This is more than is humanly possible. If I don't finish this, people will be mad at me. I'm trapped. There's no way out. And blah, 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 blah. And it can cycle down and cycle down. A number of years ago, I have 3 daughters. They're grown now, and they're wonderful, and I'm very proud of them. And my youngest daughter was in graduate school at the time. And I just happened to notice that she had so much to do. She had graduate school, she was working, she just had so much to do, and yet I never heard her complain about it. And at the time I was working, I was doing my own consulting, so I had freedom of scheduling people when I wanted to, and yet I was feeling like, oh, I never have enough time. And so I stepped back and said, what's happening here? And I looked, my daughter's name is Davina, I looked at Davina, and somehow she didn't make these interpretations that she couldn't get it done. It was like, okay, I'll do this, and I'll get this done. And that was a real big wake-up call, to learn from my own daughter how I was interpreting my workload and how she was interpreting her workload. So, any questions or comments before we move forward in this? I'm going to give you an opportunity to look at this in your own lives. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now is take just 30 to 40 seconds now. Think about a situation in your work that feels burdensome, that you're complaining about, that you wish would go away. Think about a situation. Okay. And then pair up with the person on your right and take about 3 to 5 minutes to tell each other what the situation is, unenlightened. Just tell it like it is, okay? And then I want you to stop and then help each other pull apart the phenomenon and the story, the interpretation that you have. And then the third piece is come up with one new interpretation. So I'm going to, let's see how I want to do this now. Let's, in each pair, pick an A and a B. Okay, A, you're going to go first, and I'll time this. A, you're going to tell your story just like it is, and then stop. And then you're going to, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to pull apart the phenomenon and the interpretation. And B, you can help the person. And then the third thing is come up with one new interpretation. And then we'll kind of take a time check and see how far along you've gotten. Okay, so A and B, you've got those 3 tasks to do. Any questions about that? Okay. Get to work. So let's have some volunteers who are the Bs. So it wasn't your situation. I want the Bs. Let me have a B volunteer first of all. We'll do it that way. Come on, guys. You're leaders. A volunteer, B.
I have more of a question first.
Oh, sure.
But
Sure.
the first interpretation that we received was a positive possibility interpretation.
Okay.
So is it necessary to then come up with a new way of thinking about
Okay.
it if the first?
Okay, that's a great question, because it's not wrong or negative that we interpret. We need to interpret. We have to interpret all the time. We have to interpret safety, danger, all the time, all kinds of things to interpret. The question to ask yourself is my interpretation, does my interpretation get me toward my goal? Does my interpretation help me to achieve what it is I want to achieve? So it's not necessarily wrong, but the thing is that sometimes we're so on automatic and we think the interpretation is the truth. So the big piece here is to be separating it out and say, there's several ways I ask myself this question. One way is I say, if I brought 5 people or 10 people in the room, would we all have the identical interpretation? That's one way. The other way is to say, is it inarguable? You know, can this interpretation not be argued? So those are 2 little kind of litmus tests for myself. So we can come back. I'd be curious to hear yours. But somebody who actually found that their interpretation really didn't forward their goals or really was an inhibitor for them. Thank you.
I think my interpretation of the problem that I shared doesn't seem to me to be moving us forward.
Okay.
So I'm stuck in the interpretation. I still think that the interpretation has some validity, but I need other pieces. That's how I'm feeling at the moment.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say is, A, you're aware that you have an interpretation, that it is an interpretation. That's a step. You know, I've heard people say is, I know I'm embedded in my story, but I know it's a story. So at least that's the first step, okay? And what I'm hearing you say is that perhaps there's aspects of that interpretation that may be of value, but maybe there's other input that you could have. Would you share what the situation is? Can you share it?
Yeah, I work with Baltimore Curriculum Project. We operate 4 charter schools in East Baltimore. And in one of our schools, we're working very hard to improve the culture and climate with a particular middle grade, 6 through 8, in this school. And my deep-seated and really devotedly clung to thesis is that this issue is an adult issue. It's not about the kids, it's about the adults. And I feel as if I need to move away from the exclusive interpretation that it's teachers and move more into the leadership piece of this. You know, it's partly teachers, but it's also about leadership for teachers.
So, what is, in your situation, what is the phenomenon? What is the situation that we can't argue? It is the situation.
That the climate and culture for the middle grades is not what we expect it to be and what we need it to be for kids to have a positive learning environment.
Okay, so there's something about the climate. I want to kind of like pull this apart, because even in there might be some interpretive pieces. So what is it that if somebody came from another planet and walked into the school, what would they say is the phenomenon in that building?
I think they came and spent a day and left in a hurry. I think what they'd see is the necessity of teamwork and perhaps the absence of it.
Okay, so I'm going to pull this apart even more. What does the phenomenon of absence of teamwork look like?
Good question.
Because I could walk into a room and people could be arguing and yet maybe they're very much working as a team.
Well, it's precisely the lack of that kind of dynamic, whether it's passionate argument about a way forward. I think that's absent. And
So would you say there's a lack of conversation happening?
the conversation's a negative conversation. You know, if you go back to the optimist versus the pessimist, many of the conversations are more pessimistic than optimistic. That goes back to also the need for a leader to be visionary, so it pushes towards the leadership issue. You know, are we presenting a vision of the possibilities in appropriate ways?
Okay, so one phenomenon that you're naming is that the conversations are negative. Now, this in itself could be challenged. This could be subjective, because what you say is negative and what I say is negative could be different. So I'm actually putting it in quotes here. So there's conversations that are happening that, how could you describe them?
It's a bit of a generalization, but I would say that they're characterized by pointing fingers at kids rather than looking at adult behavior.
Okay, so there's some blaming conversations happening? Okay. I mean, even this has the potential of being subjective, but I think we probably could all get on the same page about what a blaming conversation seems like. So I'm going to go with that, but I just really want to show you how nuanced this can be, and sometimes you really do have to drill down.
There's a lot of if-only conversation.
Okay, so people say if only a lot. Okay. Okay. Anything else besides conversations that you can see in the building?
My perspective is that there are fragmented relationships, but again, that's quite subjective.
Okay, so hear that. So you caught that. Okay. Any data? Any student data that you have?
Lots of
Lots of data.
more data than
Okay. Okay, so data is usually pretty, more data than you want.
You can fill in the blank for that.
Yeah. So what is the data, if you were to summarize, what's the data showing?
That we're not moving kids to where we think they could be, given.
So
what we
low,
know about
would
our
you say
kids.
low, is it accurate to say low scores?
To some extent, although I'm cautious about suggesting that data is simply scores. You know, there's behavioral data, there's disciplinary data, there's a whole range, attendance data for adults, punctuality data. As I say, we have more data and more interpretations of the data than maybe we need, but there's certainly
Okay.
lots of evidence.
Okay, so for this purpose, I'm just gonna put data, that there's some data that there's, some poor performance. I mean, can we just, okay. Okay. So, what-
And one thing I'd add, these adults who may have adult issues, lots of really good people, working really hard.
okay, so good people could be subjective. Hardworking could be subjective, but I think we can, I think we could flesh out, that hardworking people put in a lot of hours, they're putting in a lot of thoughtfulness, so I feel a little bit more comfortable putting that here. So, what are some of the interpretations that are not moving you forward to where you want to be?
Well, it's one thing to say that the issues in the school are typically adult issues. That is, the issues that are holding kids back are typically adult issues. It's one thing to say that, and it's a giant leap to get to strategies that will help you, A, find out if that's an accurate analysis, and B, if it is accurate, what are the strategies that you can create.
So one interpretation that I caught was adult issues are the problem. What else did you say?
Well, I was just reminded that one of the things I mentioned in our conversation was that we have tried to some extent changing the players. We've made some staffing changes.
Okay, staffing change is a phenomenon. Okay. Any other interpretations that are questionable, that are subjective, that you could see, or that you could hear, your partner could hear in this story?
You indicated that it's your perception that some of the teachers really do not like the children.
I think that's,
Okay.
that's fine. That's not under education.
Can you come up with one more? Do you see that this is an interpretation?
These children.
Don't like these children.
I'm guessing.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's probably these children rather than children in general. I think they all love children in the abstract. Maybe not.
Okay, is there one more interpretation that really might be holding you back? That now you can see as an interpretation, and your partner can help too?
That it's an issue of teamwork. That
Okay.
it's inefficient or ineffective teamwork,
Okay,
or
I'm
lack
just
of
going to say
teamwork.
lack of teamwork.
That's certainly been an interpretation.
Okay.
I really feel under the microscope here.
I thank you.
I'm assuming that this, we're sort of pinpointing one example. I'm assuming that people are thinking about this in terms of
one of my teachers says that we are unique, but we're not different. So I think that there's learning here, and I thank you for sharing this. Okay, so we have some interpretations, we have some phenomenon. Did you come up with any new before I say that, where do you want to be? Like a year from now, where's your dream? Where would you like to be around this issue?
I think I want, a more established learning climate that could be recognized by virtually anybody who visited the middle grades. That they would
So,
recognize that it was a place where kids were successful, were happy, maybe a stretch for middle grades kids to be happy being in school.
so would you
But
say,
that they'd be learning and in an environment that encouraged it.
okay, so successful learning environment. Nice spelling. And I want to point out that this word could be subjective.
Sure.
So, if I was really working with somebody on this, I would say the next thing is, what are your measures of success? How do you measure success? Okay, so, and anybody can help with this, because we got somewhat of a picture here of what's going on, I think. So what are some interpretations that are not these that could get us over here? So we've got this phenomenon. Yeah.
That if there are adult issues with leadership, that maybe the leadership requires some more support or training.
Okay.
Assuming that maybe they're not able to deliver the expectations, maybe there's a lack in a disconnect between the outcome and the process, and it could be a lot of different things, but I just read like some type of training, some type of support to help implement this thing.
So that connects to the idea of not looking as broken, but what are the possibilities here? What are the opportunities for training?
So, John, thank you for being so honest. We probably all have situations like that, we don't like to admit. But I think you have a lot of adults, and they're can be potentially unhappy, and so you could flip it to say, if you could take that and turn that in a way to motivate them, so like show them when they change something, it changes the dynamic in the room, that makes their job easier, and then it will make them want to continue. So see it as an opportunity of somehow taking their dissatisfaction and catalyzing that into change.
So I think what I'm hearing you say is the new interpretation being is, what opportunity is here? Or even like the shoes marketing people, fabulous opportunity. Fabulous opportunity to bring people together. Fabulous opportunity to re-inspire. What are the possibilities there? Okay, so I'm just going to put down.
Got a hand back in there.
Yeah, okay, one.
I was gonna say, as far as some adults don't like these children, and I think trying to think of like maybe these adults haven't been able to identify relationships with these children, and so sometimes I don't think any kid is horrible. I mean, there's bad kids, but I don't think there's any like malicious child, and so sometimes we don't have a relationship where you don't know their story. It's just kind of like, oh, they're bad kids, and maybe they haven't developed relationships or learned their learning styles.
So another interpretation is let's get to know these children. Yeah, okay. Okay.
It's sort of a corollary to that. It seems to me if there's something wrong in school, almost by definition, it's an adult issue. So I would probably quarrel with putting that as an interpretation, unless there's something in the drinking water. I would think that it would be the problem of adults and not the children.
Yeah, we said that was an interpretation, that it's an adult issue.
Okay, then I'm misunderstanding. I mean, I'm taking that as a given, not something that is.
Can't argue that.
Yeah,
Well, that's my point, is
Yeah.
that we can actually live into this as if this is a reality. This is the truth. This is the truth, when in fact,
But his point is that it is.
oh.
yeah, exactly.
Oh, I'm misunderstanding you then.
Yeah, I would say it's sort of axiomatic. If there's a problem in the school, it's an adult problem.
So he's saying it should be a
phenomenon.
It should be a phenomenon because the kids as a group aren't inherently problematic. It's the relationship between the parents, between the teachers and the students that's the problem, and who's responsible for that relationship primarily.
Well, on one hand, you're probably right. I mean, it's probably a good analysis. And there could be much more than that. Yes, you know, because I think if you're coming from the premise that the adults are making the decisions, but there's other nuances there. You know, maybe it's the building. You know, maybe it is the water. Yes, now these are ultimately adult issues, so I get that. But the point is that I really want you to pull apart, like, I don't know what you mean by adult issues. So pull it apart a bit more. Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, well, I was gonna say, maybe some of the issues that the children are bringing to school aren't issues that teachers have ever been exposed to or trained to. So I think that you have to be realistic about where children are coming from, get educated on that, and then help equip the teachers and also other resources that teachers don't. The primary function of a teacher is to educate the child in the classroom. And if the child has issues that they aren't equipped or don't know about, then you have to be creative about finding resources, partnering with outside agencies to support the children's learning. Because if not, it's going to be the same thing. And it's not always on the adult. If they're not, you can't hold anybody accountable for something that they don't already know how to do or aware of.
I think ultimately you're right that it is an adult issue, because adults are the decision makers. But we want to be able to pull it apart and see within that what are the sub-assumptions that are being made. Okay, does that settle right? Okay. And okay, you go, then you go.
Okay, thank you. I think that, one, to speak to the strengths that you identified, particularly with people working hard. So if they're working hard, the question is, how are they working and what are they working toward? And I think that it's great that you have the strength, but then we have to ask, well, if we have this strength, how can we make better use of it? How can we make them work in a different way? And that's probably one thing that has to happen. Secondly, with the adult issues, I actually thought of it in terms of a system. They're within a system and they're acting based on very prescribed ways of doing things. So the question is, how can you reform the system and affect their mindset and the way that they approach the work? So I actually don't think it's an adult issue, because one thing you said that was really important, you said some of the adults are pointing fingers at the kids. And I think that when you turn and say it's adult issues, then that's you, not at the school, pointing fingers at the adults who are at the school. So it's like you're turning around and doing what you're accusing them of doing, when really we can take the strength of them being a hard worker and try to implement a system and a change in mindset that will really make use of that.
So you've pulled apart some of the nuances here.
I'm sorry, not going too deep.
No, he just took the words right out of my mouth. Like, it's completely, you can't have a culture where there's some bad people and there's not other bad people. So if you are calling the kids bad, I think what's happening is if you call the adults bad, they're feeling that and projecting that then onto the kids. So you can't have it both ways. You can't not have bad kids and have bad adults. You just have to have people who are in a culture that's creating a context that's difficult for them to be productive.
So as leaders or as a consultant, I would actually even go back and say, well, what do you mean by bad? What are the phenomenon of bad? And then we look at the phenomenon of bad. and then we say, where do we want to be? And what are the interpretations that are going to help us go from the phenomenon of bad kids to here? What are the interpretations? What are other ways that we can frame? It's about framing. How else can we frame the problem? Or how else can we frame the phenomenon so that we can get to the real goals that we have? So there's a lot of work that can be done here. We just like scratched the surface. Did you want to?
I just was going to say, I think another thing that's important is, like the gentleman over there said about, taking the strengths, like that, if you have a team of really hardworking folks, making sure that they're all working towards that common goal and everybody's aware of what that vision is and bought into that vision and invested in that vision, because a successful learning environment could look different to everyone. Probably would look different to everyone. And so making sure that the people who you're sort of empowering to do this work are bought in and understand what that looks like. And I think getting that feedback, I think, is really important as well.
So you guys have, a lot of you have moved, into suggestions, which is great. And I think there's probably a storehouse of suggestions in this room. What I really want you to take away with is to take a step back from actually coming up with even positive solutions, to build the skill to be able to pull this apart when you're stuck. Where are you and the people that you're working with, where are you on automatic, making assumptions that you're not challenging and believing that they are the truth with a capital T? Again, this isn't right or wrong, but what I'm offering you is a skill for those times when you get stuck. And even in your personal life, think about the conversations you have with the people that you live with, and you're living as if certain things are the truth. And we are so much on automatic about it. We have these habits of responding. And some of them are very, very positive habits. But do we know that we're even awake? Are we even awake to the fact that we're acting and thinking in a habitual way? So again, if it's not broken, things are going fine, keep doing what you're doing. But in those places where you find yourself stuck, where you find yourself not able to move forward, whether personally or organizationally or as a team, see how you can step back, say, what is this that's absolutely true, and what are the assumptions we're making, and are there other assumptions that we could be making? And this is a really creative and juicy process when you can stop and engage in that.
I just want to appreciate the sort of collaborative nature of the phenomenon interpretation process we just went through. So I think this idea that pulling it apart requires a set of thought partners that are sort of trusted advisors to you, and being able to say, like, here's how I'm thinking about it. I know it seems crazy, but can we pull apart the phenomenon?
Exactly. When I'm working with my own group, or when I'm working with as a consultant, I say, if we have 2 hours to work together, let's take 45 minutes and just pull out the stops. What are all the interpretations that we could make? And then revisit it. And it's a really juicy, creative process. And also, when I'm doing this, ideally, I love to work with people that I know have a different perspective than I do. It can be challenging, but it's really, really rich. People that can challenge my assumption. I mean, I feel if I really, really am in the business of finding a constructive way to go with something that I'm stuck with, if I can entertain other perspectives and we can join together to entertain other perspectives, that we can open up a brand new lens to meeting the challenges that we have. We're going to run out of time. I want to leave you with something to entice you. And it very much connects to what frame am I looking at something. I cannot think of a time when I have had a complaint or somebody else has had a complaint where underneath it there was not some request in disguise. So when you leave, think about, what are my complaints and what request do I have? Who could I ask? You know, whether it's something a behavior you want somebody to change, whether it's a delegation of something, but think about that. And we are starting at 1, right? And then I am going to give you homework, and you don't have to report it back to me. What I would like you to do is exchange, if you feel comfortable doing this, again, it's, you know, if you feel comfortable, but I think it would be very useful. Exchange email or some kind of contact information with the person that you worked with. And in a week from now, email each other about one thing that you did to either pull apart phenomenon and story or made a request out of a complaint, and touch base with each other on it. And the reason for this is that I give a lot of workshops, and I'm sure you've gone to a million workshops in your professional life. And what happens is you go home, you go back to your work, and it was a great idea, and it was a nice way to get out of the office, and very few of these things really stick. And so one of the things that we emphasize in the programs that we teach is the notion of practice. And there's different statistics out there, but some say it takes 21 days to build a new habit. So if you want to build a new habit around not making assumptions or challenging your assumptions, if you want to make a habit around challenging your assumptions, if you want to make a new habit about getting off the complaint into request, you're going to need to practice. And the best way to practice is to have a partner. So I would love to see you do that before you leave, exchange, and make a commitment that a week from today you will contact each other.